Hi everyone, welcome to lecture guide number 6 on the High Renaissance in Italy. This is a fun lecture, but it's also a fairly long lecture. It's going to cover the major characters of the High Italian Renaissance who came of age at the end of the Quattrocento period, the end of the 1400s, but continued on and produced most of their art in the 1500s, what the Italians call the Cinquecento. In any case, you get a nice little kind of overview of the works of Leonardo Da Vinci, Raphael Sanzio, and Michelangelo Buonarroti. So, household names in a way, and hopefully you'll have a lot of fun with this. Last week, because I had announced in the lecture that that some of the students, those who are taking it for BAS credits, would be helping you to understand the ideas of Neoplatonism, and then in a discussion section. And then because I wanted to give you a break, I put that off, but you will be doing that this week. So I will go over that very quickly at the beginning of this lecture again, but most of the major ideas in the long, lengthy explanation of Neoplatonism as an aesthetic philosophy that undergirds the Italian Renaissance, at least from the 1400s forward, that was done last week. So if you have any confusion, return to that lecture and look it over again. So as usual, download your lecture guide and have that handy for you. There's a lot of terminology today. And so, find that terminology on the lecture guide as you hear it in the lecture. So let's start with this. On the big screen, the screen that has the images on it, you see Michelangelo's David, and we'll get to that in a bit. We're going to cover Leonardo and Raphael first. But I wanted to reactivate your ideas about the context again, just so we have this clear. The historical context of works of art is really important. As I've said over and over again, it's the big belief systems of a time that find their way into the art itself. They're not always self-evident. Like, some of them are straightforward. We know that this is a very religious society. It's not surprising that the subject matter is very religious. But some of the ideas that come about in the context are implicit. They're not so straightforward. So, for instance, things like the way that people at a particular time understood Christianity in a very particular way will find their ways into the art. And in the High Renaissance, as we saw in the Quattrocento, one of the big things going on in the world that has a huge influence on the way that the art was represented are things like, the rise of the middle class, who had worked hard, achieved what they had achieved on their own merits, and of course started to adopt and look for a humanistic philosophy that would reflect their values, right? The idea, for instance, in humanism is that we all try to perfect ourselves, and we try to perfect those people around us. We try to perfect our art. We understand that during the High Renaissance and the Renaissance in general as something that, because they're so religious, that God wants from us as well. This then gives rise to the aesthetic philosophy of Neoplatonism, which is, on the one hand, it's these people who really admired the ancient Greeks and the Romans, loved their philosophy, their ways of learning, thought of their art as a reflection of these values. And so they start reading a lot of that philosophy and trying to figure out a way that philosophy might be, mixed together with their own, much more important to them, Christian theology. And this becomes Neoplatonism. Remember, as I said last time as well, Neoplatonic truth, Neoplatonism, in other words, which is this mixing together of Plato and Aristotle and ancient philosophers and theologists in the Renaissance period, starts with the premise of Plato that there is this realm of transcendent universal truths, which Plato calls the realm of forms, and that this world is an imperfect reflection of that more perfect, timeless, universal realm of forms. That then gets mixed together with Aristotle, who believed that the order or kind of logic of the world actually exists not in some other realm, that realm of forms that Plato talked about, but rather was implicit in the world around us. Or the way that he put it was that there's an order that is beneath the appearance, and that appearance of the world is very chaotic and random, but beneath all that is a kind of order in the world. And Aristotle felt like you could see that order in the world if you were a very, very strict empiricist, meaning through observation and through kind of rational understandings of what you had seen, you could start to understand that order in the world. And I use the analogy of physics. You see things happen in the world, they seem like they are random, and yet there are physical laws that govern the relation of things in the world, for instance, gravity and so forth. This then gets mixed together, and this is where it becomes Neoplatonism. This gets mixed together with Christian ideas, which start from the premise that God is, all-knowing and he's all-powerful. And of course, they believe, Christians do, that God created this world. And because, just in a rational kind of way, God is all-knowing and all-powerful, one would believe that he created this world with something of his perfection and order in the world around us. Most importantly in this equation is the idea that God created man in his image. And think about that a bit. If we're all created in God's image, and if God is perfect and all-knowing, one would have to believe rationally that there's something of God's perfection in us, right? So you get a kind of mixing together of Plato and Aristotle with the idea of God as the divine craftsman who made all things, and you come out with this equation that goes something like, God's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, he created this world, he created us in his image. There must be something of his order in this world. It's not always readily apparent to us. We don't see it necessarily, but it's there. Now, traditionally, of course, it was the clergy that were there to help provide us with access to God's order in the world. But during the time of the Quattrocento into the High Renaissance, artists began arguing that they are kind of special types of seers, that they can see God's order in the universe, or that they're divinely inspired, and that their art, and this is the key idea, is the most close approximation of God's perfection in the world that one can find. They're not interested in representing the way the world looks, right? That's not important to them. That's like Plato saying, if you're representing the world as it looks, it's just representing something that is an imperfect reflection, the phenomenal world, of already an imperfect reflection, right? Art is a reflection of the phenomenal world, and thus is kind of twice removed if it's just being purely mimetic, just trying to copy the way things look from this more perfect realm, which we all want to gain access to. But that gets mixed up with Aristotle and so forth, and so we come up with this idea that artists are representing idealism, the most perfect representation of the world, the most perfect representation of the body, so as to bring us into proximity of God himself. So let's see how some of this plays out. Remember the Platonic Triangle? This is absolutely a component of all High Renaissance art, all Quattrocento art, at least in those centers that were influenced by classical beliefs, in that if you wanted to represent something that is truthful or something that was understood as morally good, it must also necessarily be beautiful. You can't have one of these terms or one of these concepts without the other. They all go together. Because as good Christians, they believe that God was inherently good, truthful, and beautiful all at once. These are all aspects of God. Remember this as well. These are the things that you look for. These are the stylistics of the Renaissance from the Quattrocento forward, right? So what did we say period styles were? They're basically the general characteristics that one expects to find in art produced in a particular culture during a particular time span. And the logic behind this is that because these works of art are all products of a particular set of ideological beliefs, they probably all reflect those beliefs in some ways, and we can find those in these general characteristics. So remember, we're looking for idealism, we're looking for unity of all things to one another, such that nothing can be added, nothing subtracted. The key watchwords for idealism are, the Renaissance artists believe in rationality, clarity, and order. Art should appeal to the mind, not the senses. Some of the ways that you achieve those rational kinds of works of art or clear and ordered works of art are through perspectival systems, linear 1 and 2 point perspective, which we'll cover today. Clear distinctions between middle ground, foreground, and background so as to separate space into these different zones. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about this as the so-called Renaissance law of thirds, as if every part of a work of art could be subdivided into ever smaller thirds and still have this kind of ordering principle. An emphasis on line, or what the Italians call disegno, and not color, because they believe that line appealed to the mind, whereas color appealed to the senses. Stable compositions set up on horizontals and verticals or pyramidal compositions rather than something that had a lot of diagonals or was, set up in a way that created a lot of dynamism or movement. Those later terms apply to things that are meant to provoke emotions, and Renaissance art is all about the rational. Balance, symmetry, and of course, analogous or harmonious colors, colors that are close to each other on the color wheel, rather than things that contrast with each other on the color wheel, or, Start with Leonardo da Vinci. Everyone knows about Leonardo da Vinci to some degree. Everyone's heard about this guy. He was one of the most important of the high Renaissance artists. He's a little bit older than Michelangelo, who was a little bit older himself than Raphael. Leonardo da Vinci, like all of these artists, studied under master artists and originally kind of began his career a bit in Florence, but the vast majority of his career took place in Milan. He worked for a powerful middle-class family, and remember, middle class means these merchants and bankers who had made a ton of money, and one of those humanistic values in their art. That family's name is the Forza family, SF here, Sforza family, and I think it's really interesting to note in the case of Leonardo that, he like especially Michelangelo, was very much a Renaissance man, which is meant to signify a person who was interested in cultivating all aspects of his rational mind, artistry, poetry. He dabbled in architecture. He was an amateur botanist. Many of you know he invented a whole host of things, although it turns out he wasn't the original inventor of a lot of those flying contraptions and so forth. He was someone who saw other people's inventions and tried to perfect those things. And I find it interesting to note as well that when he went to the Duke of Milan, the Forza family, and basically did what today we might think of as his job interview, he really pushed the idea that he was an engineer and an inventor first, and only later did he say, hey, and kind of, by the way, I'm also an artist. He worked in a lot of different areas, in other words. What you see in front of you is an iconic image from the Renaissance. It's the so-called Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. It comes from one of his notebooks. There are three major notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, usually referred to as the codexes or the codices. And in this case, what you're looking at is a canon of perfect proportions. Remember what that means. It is in this case, an image that is meant to represent the perfect proportionality of the human body, what the Greeks called symmetria, what we're calling the ideal human body. And remember what this is all about. Representing the perfect human body is a way to represent the body in God's image. And if you represent it perfectly, you're coming into contact with the closest thing on earth that you can come in contact with that comes from God. Now, in this case, what you may not know here is that the term Vitruvius actually refers to a Roman. He was the architect, among other things, for Julius Caesar. Vitruvius wrote a text called the 10 Books of Architecture, which all of these Renaissance artists would have read. And I've given you, as you'll kind of note in your readings, some very, very short primary readings from Leonardo and Michelangelo and one from Raphael, just to give you a flavor of what they thought of their own art. And when you're looking at those from the Jansen readings, these little excerpts, note the way that they think about ideals. In this case, that text, Vitruvius's text, describes the way that one might generate the perfect ideal human body. And the way that Vitruvius puts this is, imagine a man lying on his back, and in his navel is the pointy end of one of those drawing compasses, the things that you use to draw a circle. If that pointy end is in his navel and you see him in this form with his arms outspread and his legs outspread, his perfect proportions would fit within a perfect circle. Right? So what he's saying is, this is a way to generate the perfect human body. The navel is the center, and a perfect circle will circumscribe his outstretched arms and his feet. The other thing that Vitruvius says, and that's why the square is here, is that if this human being continues to lie on his back with his arms perfectly outstretched, again, parallel to the ground, or in this case, kind of perpendicular to his body if he's lying on his back, and his legs are outstretched, the breadth of his body from fingertip to fingertip would be exactly the same as the height of his body. He also went on to say that the perfect human body is exactly 8 heads tall, including the head itself, and on and on and on. So if you see these little markings there between the length of a hand and the arm and the shoulder and the midsection to the upper torso and so forth, those are all Leonardo's way of designating this perfect proportionality of the human body that all Renaissance artists are striving to achieve. In his codices, because I can't bear to let these go without kind of showing you these, you should know that in order to determine those perfect proportions, during the Renaissance, a lot of Renaissance artists participated in what were known as anatomy lessons or dissections of human bodies. Now, for the most part, these things were not public. They're all private because the church frowned upon the dissection of the human body. They felt that the human soul was housed in the human body. They didn't know how long that this continued after death. And they were fearful that if you dissected or in any way desecrated the human body, that you might ruin the house for the soul. So they really didn't want this to occur. But everyone was doing it. I mean, I shouldn't say everyone, but a lot of people were doing this, both in the realms of science and also in the realms of art, so as to figure out how that human body is put together, how we tick. And for Renaissance artists, they actually believe things like the human body, both inside and out, in all of its complexity, is a manifestation of God's order. And so understanding ourselves inside and out, so to speak, was a way to come into proximity with God himself. And you see here on the left-hand side a human embryo in a womb that's been kind of opened up, so you can see this with all Leonardo's notes jotted around it, and a kind of open torso here with all the organs of the body set up within that torso, so as to understand the way we're put together. Renaissance artists also used these studies of the human body, though, for basic human anatomy lessons in order to understand how to generate that perfect ideal form. So here you see on the right-hand side a human skeleton. This is like, starting with the armature of the human body. Let's start with and they often did this, by the way, let's start with a perfect human skeleton. We can study it, then set it up, and then on the left-hand side, you see the musculature, for the most part, that clothes this human skeleton. Let's get that all right, and then let's move on to putting clothes on these figures and so forth. In other words, building the body from the ground up, knowing how all of the muscles exist in that body, knowing God's order in setting up all these proportionalities is the way to generate the perfect ideal human body. On the right, you see a heart form. They're starting to, figure out about the human organs, and on the left, something that I think is really interesting, and it shows you why someone like Aristotle might have been incredibly popular when you started studying the idea of, is there a perfect order in the universe around us that maybe we don't see at first glance, but if you study it, if through empiricism you observe and you chart things out, can you find that order? One of the coolest things is to study the human head. The human head, as you see on the left, is really, really set up according to proportionality. And you see this a little bit in Leonardo's little sketch of this kind of cross-section of the human skull. Our eyes, if you've ever taken a drawing class before, you will have heard this. Our eyes are directly in the center of our skull, right? They're halfway in between the top of our head and our chin. The place that the bottom of our nose hits here is actually halfway in between the eyes and the chin. The ears attach exactly where the eyes are and attach exactly where the bottom of the nose is here as well. The mouth is a little bit different. It's not in halves, it's in thirds. The opening of the mouth is 1/3 down from the bottom of the nose, and then you have this dip in the chin here, which is another third down, and then the bottom of the chin, and on and on and on. So you can see how if people started studying human anatomy and finding all these ratios that seem really mathematical, they would believe that there is a kind of perfect order in the human body. And because they're Christian, they believe that God put it there. A couple more examples of this. Again, another skeletal form on the left-hand side. And then something I just wanted you to know, one of the things that Leonardo was really interested in, and one of the reasons he was hired by the Duke of Forza, was military engineering. All of these Italian city-states, as I've said before, are not unified. Many of the time they are warring against one another, and providing for the Duke of Forza, in this case, a giant cannon that could be used to hold off any kind of opposing forces was something that he pitched to him. He also told the Duke of Forza, and we know he was very good at this, that he knew about hydraulic engineering, the use of, in particular, different pulley systems, but also water that he believed he could bring down anyone else's, castle walls with. The first major work of art that I wanted to show you from Leonardo da Vinci is another Annunciation scene. On your next probably quiz, you will be asked to do a comparison and contrast of two different paintings on the same subject, so as to point out the similarities and differences and make some assertions about what those differences mean in relation to the beliefs of the time system. So here we have something that should be pretty kind of common, familiar to you. In the Annunciation scene here on the left-hand side is the angel Gabriel speaking to, on the right-hand side of our screen, the Virgin Mary. Again, it's not historically accurate in any way. That's not important to these Renaissance artists, at least at this point. In that, for instance, the architecture here isn't from Jerusalem. This isn't what you'd expect to find in Jerusalem when it comes to the flora and the fauna. The Virgin Mary didn't come from a particularly prominent family, and yet here she is dressed impeccably and sitting in front of what looks like a contemporary Italian piazza, or palace. But none of that's important, because the most important thing is to show the ideal representation of this Annunciation scene. So what are some of the ways that this is ideal? Well, first and foremost, look at the characters themselves. Mary doesn't look like she came from the Middle East. She looks like a typical, beautiful Italian woman. At the time, blonde hair and fair features were all the rage, and so that's the way that they show her. She's also ideal in her demeanor. Meaning, as I've said before, just imagine yourself in the scenario where an angel shows up in your bedroom and says, hey, by the way, you're pregnant and the father of your child is God. How are you likely to respond? She shows zero emotion. She's got this very rational acceptance of this major, major news, and that is something that the Italian Renaissance culture really aspired to. What we'll hear today is called riposo, inner calm, inner repose here, rather than an emotional response to this major news. The features of the figure and their proportionality is based upon perfect proportions again, both the angel and the Virgin Mary herself. Back to the overall image once more. Other ideals here, some of you can see this. Follow my cursor here. These stones off on each side of the architecture, follow the lines here. They all recede to the same point, don't they? You can see them all going to the same place. That shows you that the artist is using linear one-point perspective to generate the space. Now, as I said last week, linear one-point perspective is the perfect representation of space. It's not the way that our eye sees it, but it partakes of God because it's ideal. The other thing that's very ideal about this is, and there can be many of them, look at those trees in the background. They look like someone's gone out there with pruning shears and made them all perfect, right? Like Disneyland trees or something like that. You wouldn't find those in nature, but they've been made perfect here because idealism reigns supreme. Another thing that we can note about this work of art are just some general terms that we've talked about before. Notice how things in the foreground, and this isn't a part of the ideals, by the way, this is just the way that the artist generates an illusion of three-dimensionality. The items and objects in the foreground are incredibly realistic, or I should say naturalistic. They show a ton of detail, and then as we get further away to these mountains in the distance, that detail fades away, and we call that atmospheric perspective, right? Things that are in the foreground are big, things that are in the background are small. We call that size diminution. Back to the ideals here once more. You might be able to tell by looking at this work of art that another set of ideals in the work, besides ideal proportions, linear one-point perspective, and so forth, is this articulation in visual terms of a foreground, the area from this wall forward, the middle ground where these trees exist, and the deep background. There is no kind of slow recession into space. Everything is demarcated separately. You also see in terms of ideals, not symmetry, but balance. If you split this work down the middle, it's not a mirror image, but it does have kind of equal weight. There's the figure over here, the figure over here, trees over here, balanced by a big set of architecture over here. Now let's get to the symbolism. So in the foreground, you notice lots of flowers and foliage walled off from us. That is the Hortus Conclusus again, the enclosed garden that represents Mary's virginity. We also see a symbol in the foreground here. You may not know this, but this what would be known as a prie-dieu, you don't need to remember that term, an area where you would read biblical text, also looks suspiciously like a sarcophagus. And a sarcophagus is one of those above ground caskets. This is obviously built upon Roman or modeled after Roman caskets, thus bringing in the classical again. Now, why would that symbol be used with a very prominent, remember we talked about this last week, that's that scallop shell in the foreground that got used in Botticelli's Birth of Venus, but is also a symbol of purification and of baptism. Remember, Christ is born into this world to purify us from original sin, that sin that came with Adam and Eve transgressing God's will in the Garden of Eden. But even more importantly, it's a sarcophagus, it's a coffin. Why would that be used? And the answer is that Alpha Omega idea, the beginning and the end. Christ says, I am the Alpha, I am the Omega. I'm the beginning of all things, and I will return at the end of all things during the last judgment. But it's also an indication that Christ was born here in order to die, sacrifice himself on the cross for our sins. And so using the sarcophagus here, and through that symbolism, making us think about the Alpha Omega, makes us think that Christ was born so as to die for all of our sins. Now, you could go on and on about this and formally analyze the work of art. I would point out that, just in brief, informal analysis is again looking at the form elements of work of art like line and color and shape and so forth, so as to determine how those things are affecting us or how they are mediating or modifying the general subject matter of the work of art. And we've talked about this already in terms of the ideals being used. But you can probably also figure that you keep looking at the Virgin Mary. She's our focal point, right? The place that we look first. And why? Because even if we look at Gabriel first, he points to Mary. Also, though, Mary takes up a much larger visual space here than Gabriel does. And further, she partially faces us, which is a much more interesting position than Gabriel, who is in full profile. I will also point out, going back to this form, that look, Gabriel's got those lilies again, the symbols of the Trinity and of purity in his hand. One of Leonardo da Vinci's major masterpieces is a work of art that unfortunately is in a state of incredible disrepair. This is the Last Supper of Leonardo da Vinci, which was painted in Milan for the Duke of Forza, who asked him to paint in his own libraries this scene of the Last Supper of Jesus Christ. Later on, this was, and almost immediately after it was painted, it was turned into what's known as a refectory. A refectory is the place that monks will go, and priests as well, eat their meals. And so this is pretty interesting. If you can imagine a space that pretty soon after it was created was used for people to go eat, and they look down at the far wall of this space and they see a really idealistic and frankly naturalistic representation of the Last Supper that almost looks like it exists in their own space. You can imagine how effective this would be. Renaissance artists, if I haven't said this before, I should have, and I should say it now, thought of a picture as a window onto another world. It's almost like you're looking through a window onto some more perfect scene of the ideal world beyond you. And that's an important idea because for Renaissance artists, there is this kind of notion of a separation between you and what you see. And when we get to the Baroque period, that will go away. Baroque artists will want you to feel included in the scene that you're looking at. In any case, it's giant and it's moderately destroyed. I should just point this out. When we get up close on this, you'll see it's very deteriorated, and part of that is because Leonardo, being a really, very interested in engineering and perfecting things, didn't like fresco painting because it appeared too flat. It didn't give you all that luminosity and detail that you get from an oil painting. And so he tinkered around with the method of Buonafresco, a true fresco, to try to come up with something that would be, more open to greater detail and more luminosity. And his technique was to paint in tempera plus oil painting. Tempera is a form of mixing the pigments with an animal protein. And he mixed that together with oil painting, and then he painted on a dry wall. This is usually known as fresco secco or dry fresco. And it didn't work. Within a year, the paint started peeling off of the wall, and it got worse and worse, which is why about 100 years after it was painted, it was in such disrepair that this intrusion here, if you follow my cursor, which is a doorway, was cut through the actual painting itself. It was so deteriorated, they thought, why not? Easier access to the outside world, I guess. And that was never a part of the original plan itself. So let's get a on this. It's been overpainted. They restore it a million different times, and so what we're left with is this rather hazy looking painting that would have been much more defined when it was originally painted. Just like we've seen before, this Last Supper scene focuses on that moment of the Last Supper in which Jesus announces his betrayal, right? One of you will betray me, and the rest of the apostles at the table, his closest followers, start to question who this could possibly be. Now, I will go into all the stylistics in a minute, but I just want to point something out. If you look at the focal point of the painting, which is Jesus, and he's the focal point because, again, he's dead in the center of the painting, and all of the lines, including the lines of figures looking at him, these are all the implied lines, as well as the lines of the use of linear one-point perspective that come off of the ceiling, which is known as a coffered ceiling. That's the type of ceiling that has little kind of indentations in it to relieve the weight. All of these lines point to him, as do the tapestries on the wall and even the legs on the table, which you can barely see here, as well as the fact that he's framed by this light of the window behind him, which puts him in higher contrast. And of course, no one gets in Jesus's own kind of personal bubble here. These all make him the most important figure in the group. So we look at him first, and what you notice is that even though Jesus has said to his closest followers, one of you is going to betray me, he doesn't look particularly upset about this. He's very, very calm, right? He's practicing his inner Om or something like that. That's riposo. That's that inner calm that I just spoke about. It's the way that someone is, if they were perfect, would respond to any kind of situation with this inner calm. Whereas around him, of course, not quite as, let's say, ideal, are all of his apostles, who are in various states of a little bit higher agitation. Now on to, the ideals. Perhaps the first ideal in this picture is, notice how they're all arranged at one side of the table. Probably wouldn't have happened, but that sets up this thing so that we can see it all. Another ideal, riposo, right? The ideal response to this situation. Another ideal is, look at how Christ is in a very stable composition. He's that pyramidal or triangular form here that's all about stability and order. Another ideal, linear one-point perspective to generate the space of this picture. Another ideal, if you're noticing that all of the figures look about the same size and the same proportionality, they're all based on perfect canons of proportions. Thus, another ideal as well. The colors in this work, and as much as it's possible to still see them, are primarily analogous. In this case, if you split down the work in the center, we also have a balanced form with equal weight, 6 figures on each side, right? So all those Renaissance stylistics are showing up here. Unity, well, that unification of this work is achieved by, watch this, we've got a pyramidal form here, and then notably, and I'll come back to this, an empty or negative space of an inverted triangle here that makes us kind of interested in this space. Like, why is that absent? We look over to the right-hand side of Jesus. We know that's the better side, and the red really draws our attention here, so we follow his arm and go over to this side and see this form, who roughly mirrors Jesus in his form, and we notice this grouping. Right? Now notice how this grouping is a group of 3, and then we see another group of 3 over here, and then their eyes push us back this way to Jesus, and he tips his head over here, and we follow his hand, and we go to these figures, and another group of 3 over here, and another group of 3 over here. Very careful ordering of groupings of figures. That is another ideal. Knows how accurate this is, but just to show you a reconstructive painting of this, it would have looked more like this in its original iteration, with the figures looking a heck of a lot more real. Here is a couple of images. On the left, the original image, and on the right, a schematic that shows you the grouping of characters together in groups of 3 and the use of central point perspective to generate the illusion of space. Close-up of Jesus himself, practicing his riposo here, saying to everyone, one of you is going to betray me, but still remaining calm, and the rest of the figures saying, who is it? Could it be me? And so forth. And then we see this. The most important grouping. As I pointed out before, it's brilliant here that frankly what he has done is if Jesus represents through his triangular form both the symbol of the Trinity but also perfect stability, right? A form that doesn't look like it can move. Next to him is what is known as negative space or a negative shape, a shape created by the absence of forms. And that shape is the exact opposite. It's an inverted triangle, which is really unstable. It looks like it could tip over one way or another. What would that signify? Well, what it probably is meant to signify is the idea that if Jesus is gone, if Jesus leaves in his death, is instability going to follow? But then right next to it is this grouping of 3 figures that suggests no, it's not. Or these are the most important figures. Notice the closest two to him are this figure here, who is actually John the Evangelist, the closest to Jesus. He is the man who is going to continue to perpetuate Jesus's ideas in his own way. Remember, a lot of people didn't mind confusing him with the Saint John who wrote the book of Revelation and thus told of the second coming of Christ or the last judgment of Christ. Next to him, this old grumpy guy, and you can almost always understand him as, he's almost always represented as kind of the older figure in the group and a little bit grumpy, and also holding in his hands the keys is St. Peter. So he will stabilize the Christians in the absence of Christ by establishing the Church of Christ, the Catholic Church. And then finally, this character here. That character is Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot was the betrayer. He's the one who was seduced by money so as to betray Christ. And here he is represented as being very important to this story because, if you're a true believer in Christianity, you have to say that Judas needed to exist, that God made Judas because God in all his divine will and wisdom put Judas here so as to betray Christ and lead to his eventual sacrifice for us. However, Leonardo doesn't say he's a good guy in any way. What he says is he's a bad guy. And the way that he represents this is Judas is turned away from the light. All of the other figures are illuminated on their faces, but Judas doesn't get that illumination. He's turned away from the light, which is understood as God. He's actually upsetting a little salt shaker on the table with his elbow, which is an Italian symbol of bad luck, so as to point him out as the bad guy. Finally, show you chalk drawing was used as a sketch to generate Judas. You can see that he's made to look, by contemporary standards, ugly in comparison to Christ, who is beautiful and stable and calm and so forth. And rumor has it, although it's never and probably never will be confirmed, that in trying to find a model for Judas Iscariot, Leonardo da Vinci went to the thieves' quarter in Milan, think of this as a bad part of town, and started sketching thieves and assassins and bad people, believing that, of course, one's external appearance was indicative of one's inner, kind of the state of one's soul, and that by representing, in this case, evil or badness, one needed a model that was ugly. It's the opposite of Neoplatonism, in other words. If beauty represents good and truth, then ugliness represents falsehood, in this case, betrayal, and also not moral goodness, but sinfulness. You see, it wasn't only Leonardo who, when painting this work of art, in his own new technique, caused all of its damage. This is what it looked like during World War II. Santa Maria delle Grazie, where this work is, was bombed, and that tarp basically covers the Last Supper scene. I want to go through quickly a couple of other work that, if you read the Da Vinci Code, you will have come across all of these. And frankly, Dan Brown, not a single thing he said has any historical accuracy, so be aware of that. But this is one that he talked about, and it's one of Leonardo's most famous works. It's the so-called Madonna of the Rocks. This is very typical Leonardo da Vinci painting of his kind of mature career. That background that you see in this, and by the way, the subject is really simple. It's the Virgin Mary who has given birth to the Christ child who's down here. The Christ child is blessing his closest relative, who is John the Baptist, who in return is praying to him. And then over here is an angel, probably Uriel, showing that Christ comes from the heavenly realm. In any case, in the background is something you'll see in a lot of Leonardo work. He was really interested in botany and rock formations, geology, and he loved the idea of the mystery of these strange backdrops of kind of mysterious, very atmospheric landscapes as kind of the thing against which these figures are framed. In this work, remember, we've seen before, is it a manger? Is it a cave or grotto? In this case, he is settled on a grotto, a kind of cave from which, or in which, Christ was born. Now, you probably can see this as well. The composition, or the way that the figures are arranged in the space, is a pyramidal form. It's a big triangle. You can go up the contour lines, up her dress, up her head, and down her other contour line, down Uriel's contour line as well, and get this big triangle. Or you can see it this way. You look at the Virgin Mary and her eyes tilt down. You look at John the Baptist. He looks at Jesus, and then you look up this way. In any case, it's a nice, stable composition. It's also roughly balanced, right? We've got in the middle the Virgin Mary, off to one side one figure, but also a lot of light up here that commands our attention, and over here you've got a couple of figures that balance that whole thing out. It's basically a nativity scene again, right? But here's the added element to this work, and I'll just show you the compositional diagram to give you that triangle. Added to this work, is that what we're trying to say in this work was actually originally created for a church that was devoted to the Virgin of the Annunciation. What we're trying to say in this work is that Christ comes both from woman, and you see this little indication of her white bodice here that looks like a space from which Christ just came, but he also came from heaven, which is why the angel Uriel is here. And as soon as he is born, everyone, in this case we don't have the wise men and the shepherds and the ox and the ass, but everyone recognizes he is the Messiah. In this case, though, the main character, and he's not often shown, is John the Baptist, who immediately at how old is he supposed to be, by the way? 1 year old, 1.5 year old, recognizes Christ as the Messiah and is already praying to him. Now remember, John the Baptist represents Judaism, or rather the last figure born before Christ, who is a transitional figure between the old Judaic text, the Old Testament, and the New Testament. And this is another way of saying that Christ is more important than the Old Testament. Christ, in return, the perfect ideal child, is already again at the ripe old age of 1 year old, blessing John the Baptist in return. I'll just show you some close-ups. On the left is what's known as a silver point drawing of the angel Uriel, and you can see that ideal Christ down there below. By the way, the hand gesture here, which you'll see again later on in a Caravaggio work, is a gesture of protection. She's there to protect Christ. Another work on a similar theme by Leonardo da Vinci is known as The Virgin, Child, and Saint Anne. This is done around 1508 and finished about 5 years later. took him a long time to finish his large-scale oil paintings. In this case, what you basically have is a work that combines together some various things that we've already covered. Saint Anne was the mother of the Virgin Mary. And remember way back in the lecture on Giotto how much emphasis was placed on the idea that Mary was born of the Immaculate Conception, a pure vessel created from God so that Christ could come to earth. That's why she's weirdly sitting in the lap of her mother here. It's about purity of birth. One pure form, the Virgin Mary being born, and then between her legs, the Christ child here being born, a vessel born of purity, right? One more born of purity. Now, the entire form, of course, is set up in a giant pyramid again, that most stable of forms. On the one hand, stable, and on the other hand, symbolic of the Holy Trinity. And then you see that clear differentiation of foreground, in this case, middle ground with the tree here, and background represented in atmospheric perspective. And then, of course, you see up close Christ himself wrestling with a lamb like a little kid might do, but the symbolism is clear. Christ is the sacrificial lamb. He will be killed so as to wipe away our original sin here. And that's why the symbolism. Now, a few more terms for you, just so you know these. The way that Christ is represented in this incredibly delicate modeled form, right? What the Italians call Chiaro-Scuro. Everything that's further away from the light source gets a little bit darker and darker. But Leonardo was so good at this, and he used so many different layers of semi-transparent oil paints, glazes as they're called, to build up that form, that they called it smoky. And the Italian term for this is fumato. And so the specific term for Leonardo's type of really, really gentle graduation between light and dark is known as fumato. Briefly, this isn't a Leonardo da Vinci work, but it's based upon an earlier work by Leonardo da Vinci. I wanted to let you know that the interest in Greek mythology didn't go away among many of these artists, and Leonardo once created a work called Leda and the Swan, but it was destroyed. There are about 40 different copies of this work, and this is, for many, presumed to be the best of those copies. The Greek myth is one of those weird ones, as many Greek myths are, you may be aware, in which Zeus, who is perpetually on the lookout, Zeus, by the way, is Jupiter in Roman times, and he's the king of the leader of the Greek gods, is perpetually on the lookout for beautiful young women. And in this case, he seduces someone who's already a wife, Leda, who is married to Tyndareus, and he seduces her, but the way that he seduces her is by coming to her in the form of a swan. Now, if you're wondering, why does Zeus always show up as weird animals? Sometimes he's a swan, other times he's a bull, other times he's a cloud, and so forth. Part of the explanation is that he can't appear to mortal women in his godly form because he's just too kind of magnificent. He'd turn them all to dust or something like that. But the other one is that Zeus himself is married, and so he's kind of trying to disguise himself from his wife so he can get away with all of these sexual indiscretions. Now, when Zeus has sex with a mortal woman, the offspring of that union are always demigods. They're half human, half god, and they go on to be heroes in one way or another. And this union, depending on which Greek myth you're reading, led to the creation of a couple of major heroes, demigods, and they're shown down here in this kind of cool form. They're being hatched out of eggs. This is just Leonardo being inventive here. Those forms are Castor and Pollux down here, the boys. Castor and Pollux are kind of the major heroes of Sparta. They are, the major players in the myths of Sparta, this great warrior part of ancient Greece. And down here below is Helen and Clytemnestra. And we've already met Helen. Helen of Troy is the most beautiful woman on earth. the person that Paris falls in love with through the manipulations of Aphrodite or Venus, and leads to the Trojan War. The last thing to point out about this is, if you're looking at this female form and you're saying, damn, she looks, really muscular compared to especially the ideals of the time or to Botticelli's work, she is, partially because Leonardo and Michelangelo and many other artists believed that the most perfect human form was the male nude. And so they base their female figures on that perfect male nude and kind of feminize her a little bit. And with this work, of course, you can get away from it, the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa, though, as an icon of Western art, is a little bit of a head scratcher. And so I want to tell you this story. And what I mean by a head scratcher isn't that this isn't a phenomenally well painted work of art, but it's compared to the thousands of other great works of art that are out there, it's surprising that this one became so famous. And the reason I say that is that, first of all, what you're looking at here is a portrait of a woman. Portraits have never, ever been the most kind of ambitious subjects for artists. They're the way that artists get paid, right? You create a portrait for someone. And it's a really good portrait, but that doesn't explain why it's become the major icon of Western art. We actually know today who this woman is, or we believe we know that it's Lisa Gherardini del Giocondo, who was a Florentine merchant's wife. And so, yeah, she's an important woman, but she's not like, the most important woman of her time either. So that doesn't explain why this work got so important either. Before going on to the rest of the, why is this important, let me just point out some things that are kind of interesting about it. First and foremost, what she represents is the style of the time, right? She is dressed as a very, very wealthy Florentine woman in the perfect style of the time. She's acting very calmly. She doesn't show a lot of smile, which has always led people to wonder, why isn't she smiling with her eyes? She's showing this slight smile of her lips. Well, because that's the demure way that a woman was expected to engage with people, being polite and charismatic, but not being openly too affectionate. She also shows the style of the time in that during Florence at this time, and this happened about 15 years ago, plucking out pretty much all of your eyebrows was all the rage. And so she didn't have any real eyebrows here because that was the style. And they even plucked up their hairline so as to have a taller forehead, which she also is sporting here as well. She's painted using all the standard techniques, right? She's a pyramidal form. She shows beautiful modeling or chiaro-scuro that's so perfect that we call it fumato. Once again, Leonardo is used in the backdrop, this mysterious landscape to add a little bit of interest to the work. But beyond that, it's pretty straightforward. So how did it become famous? Well, the way that it became famous is that it had a really interesting history to it. When Leonardo da Vinci left Florence, he had returned from Milan to Florence for a bit and went for the final years of his life to France to work in the court of France. He took this work and two others with him, which led a lot of people to speculate that this work was so important to him that he couldn't bear to part with it. People also began to speculate, because they didn't know who this woman was, that maybe she was Leonardo da Vinci's lover. Now, that's kind of preposterous because most people know, and certainly should have known at the time, that Leonardo was gay. He was a gay man. He wasn't interested in women at all. However, they didn't know who this was for a brief period of time, so they speculated on this. Then, later on, this work, which was purchased by someone in France, ended up in the Louvre, which is the biggest museum in the world, around the time of the French Revolution, when the Louvre was turned into a museum, a little bit before this. And after the French Revolution, Napoleon decided he loved this work, and he took it out of the Louvre and put it in his own bedchamber. So it got attached to Napoleon, and things being loved by some great person adds a little bit extra interest to the work. Later, after Napoleon was deposed, it went back into the Louvre, but it hung on a wall in a style known as a salon-style hang with tons of other paintings on the wall. It was an important area. It's the grand gallery of the Louvre, but it was one of at least 60 other works on that wall, and it still wasn't particularly important at that time period. In the beginning of the 20th century, what made it so famous was that it was stolen by an Italian janitor of the Louvre, and for a year, while this man hid it in basically a kind of a clothing chest, the world speculated on who stole it, why they stole it, when it was going to return. How could this great masterpiece have blessed us? It really, you can look back at the newspapers, both the New York Times as well as all the newspapers in London and in Paris and elsewhere, and almost on a weekly basis, a new story would emerge speculating on what happened to this. After that year was done, it came to light that this man stole it, and international uproar occurred. The guy stole it, by the way. He was Italian because he believed that Napoleon had stolen this work from the Italians, which he hadn't. But its fame was ensured by being attached to a kind of media sensation. Now, the only reason I point this out is that if you get a chance to go to the Louvre, almost everyone will feel compelled to go see the Mona Lisa. Again, you go there, and frankly, there are tons of wall plaques that say, go here to find the Mona Lisa. And it's in its own space, in its own room. And almost everyone who sees it is really kind of disappointed after all the hype. It's still a great work of art, but compared to, and this is important, at any given time in the Louvre, there are 250,000 works of art on display. Compared to those other 250,000 works of art, this work is, in my estimation, not the best, not the most interesting, and it's a little bit of a letdown for most people when they see it, but don't think that just because you saw this great work of art and weren't particularly interested in it, that there's nothing else in the Louvre for you to become interested in. There's plenty there. I'm going to pause here for a minute, drink of water, and I'll be right back. You'll witness very little. I'll continue on with Raphael. Okay, on with the show here. So Raphael Sanzio was a little bit younger than both Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. He studied under Pietro Perugino, who we covered last week, and was very well respected in his own time as kind of perfecting the high Renaissance style. He became popular originally by creating series of Madonna pictures. The Madonna is just another way of saying the Virgin Mary. And what you see in front of you here is the example that is in your textbook. It's the so-called Madonna of the Goldfinch. Raphael, again, you could probably do this on your own at this stage, but exemplifies all the stylistics of the high Renaissance here. What we're witnessing is a scene that's not so dissimilar than what you just saw in Leonardo's work, the Madonna of the Rocks, in that we've got, as the subject matter, the Virgin Mary with the Christ child placed between her legs, again, to emphasize the idea that Christ was born of man or born of woman. And off to his right is John the Baptist. Now they're playing with the goldfinch, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But what I mean by the ideal style here, that ideal kind of Renaissance classical style, is notice again, follow my cursor, that this is all set up as a giant pyramid, right? Oops. A giant pyramid here, in that, you follow the contour lines of the outside of the body, and you've got a big kind of triangular pyramidal form here. At the top, you see the Virgin Mary. She is our immediate focal point. We look at her, and she glances down at John the Baptist, who looks at Jesus, and he becomes a major focal point as well, because he's this very highly contrasted light form, the nude form between her legs, so as to emphasize him. We have a clear differentiation of foreground, middle ground, and background once more. We've got a very symmetrical painting as well, equal weight on both sides, one tree on one side, a couple on the other. A clear articulation of, again, everything that's here in the front, and then a separation to the middle ground, and then in the deep background using atmospheric perspective again. We've got the, the rolling hills and so forth. Now, what is being said here, or what are some of the ways that I can offer a little bit more to you than just that? Well, number one, the Virgin Mary is, again, perfect looking. She's, those of you who have children or have been around children before, been around young mothers, know that usually young mothers aren't so put together, right? They can't deal with two children and be reading, the Bible at the same time. They have their hands full, and yet she's having no problem with it. She looks intensely calm. That's inner riposo again, while she deals with these kids. And of course, her features are perfect, as is her proportionality. Both the proportions of the children are also based upon classical sculptures. Notice how Jesus is in his contrapposto pose again. It's very languid. He's kind of leaning back here, but it's a very contrapposto pose as well. John the Baptist is easy to recognize because he is accompanied by his usual iconography. He's got kind of, very, curly, unruly hair. You can imagine that growing out to be the ragged form of John the Baptist that'll become later. And he's dressed in this kind of fur onesie. He's already in animal furs here to reference his later asceticism, right? Living a life devoted only to his religiosity. The other thing that I can point out about this is that, and it's a weird thing to have to say, but I'm going to point it out. Many people note that over and again, Jesus will be showing his genitalia. Now, in this case, he's wearing some kind of weird little transparent sash, but it's been pulled up to show his genitals. And the reason for that is to emphasize the idea that Christ is man, that he's human. And so you see a lot of that kind of picturing. The other thing that I can point out to you is this area here is actually a little river that flows beneath this bridge. You'll oftentimes see the Virgin Mary accompanied with water in the background, and this probably is symbolic of a famous Italian phrase that the Virgin Mary is the port of the shipwrecked, meaning she's a kind of mediator figure. If you've come across tough times or you've been sinful, the Virgin Mary is your mediator between you and God. She's someone that you go to and you beg forgiveness and you ask for repentance, and she'll put in a good word for you with God. The final thing is to say, why is the goldfinch here? Well, on the one hand, the goldfinch actually shows up in the Gospels in that when Christ is on his way to Golgotha carrying he's been crowned with a crown of thorns and he's carrying his cross, a goldfinch supposedly comes down to him and starts plucking the thorns out of his head from the crown of thorns. And that's supposedly the way that the European goldfinch gets a little red spot on it. But the other reason is that goldfinches and little birds, and if you've been to Europe, you know this, are oftentimes pets for children. And so it fits in with that logic as well. You've got a little short excerpt reading in which Raphael is writing to the man that you see over here on the left-hand side, Baldassare da Castiglione. Baldassare da Castiglione was a very close friend of Raphael's. He painted this portrait of him here, who wrote a book on Renaissance manners called The Courtier. And in this book on Renaissance manners, he points out that riposo, inner calm, is the most important thing that a gentleman can affect. This rational response that holds back emotions as we exist in our everyday lives. And you see that same inner calm referenced in the face of the Virgin Mary over on the right-hand side here. I also wanted you to note when you do that reading that, this is a friend of Raphael, and notice how deferent Raphael is to his opinion. This isn't the age in which artists think they're better than everyone else. He's asking for advice from this man on how to create ideal form. The most famous of all the the Madonnas is this one here called the Sistine Madonna. And many of you will recognize these characters at the bottom, the little cherubs, or putti as they're oftentimes called, because they've been pulled out of this work and put on, coffee cups and t-shirts and so forth. What this Madonna is, it was actually originally commissioned to be a kind of memorial painting for the death of Julius II. Julius II was the Pope at the time of the High Renaissance. He was instrumental in commissioning some of the most important works of art created during the High Renaissance. He, for instance, commissioned the creation of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He started the rebuilding of the new St. Peter's in Rome, where Raphael functioned as the head of all architectural and archaeological projects in Rome. He was the original kind of planner for the new St. Peter's. And he commissioned works that you'll see coming up by Raphael in the Stanza Della Signatura. So originally this work was supposed to be a kind of commemorative for him. And the way it works is that, and we'll start to see this device used more and more, especially in the Renaissance period, this theatrical device of having curtains drawn so as to show us a particular scene. It kind of increases the drama of the picture. In the center is the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, who are coming kind of to the doorway of heaven in order to bring Pope Julius into heaven. He's so important that the Madonna and the Christ child actually come to bring him into heaven themselves. Flanking the Virgin Mary, and notice how this is all a pyramidal form again, are, and you don't need to remember that this is a very particular Pope, Pope Pius, who was a relative of Pope Julius, but he was a very important person, a relative of Julius II, on one side, and on the other side, Saint Barbara, who is the patron saint of men at arms or warriors. Now, why she's there is that she is Julius II's patron saint. Believe it or not, Julius II was called the warrior pope because he extended the holdings of the Vatican. He had a standing army and a navy. He extended the holdings of the Vatican immensely. And so he's known as the warrior pope. And then down below, amidst all of this incredible seriousness, as a kind of form of comic relief, and in order to create a trompe-l'oeil painting, a painting that looks like it's incredibly realistic. Remember, trompe-l'oeil means fool the eye. You have these two putti kind of affecting gestures of boredom or come on, get on with the whole thing. Up in the background, you can see this kind of glowing nimbus of Christ. Around him are all of these, if you look over here, these little faces that are emerging from the cloud forms. Those are all the souls that are already in heaven itself. Very briefly, I wanted to show you one of the reasons that Raphael became so famous is that he was understood to have perfected the style that started in the Quattrocento. This is a work called The Marriage of the Virgin. We've seen this subject before, starting with Giotto, in which, again, the husband for the Virgin Mary is chosen. Joseph is chosen because his rod flowers. And you're seeing these figures being married here by a priest in the center and a church in the background. What I mean by perfecting the style is that look familiar to you. On the right now is Pietro Perugino's The Delivery of the Keys to St. Peter. And all Raphael has done is basically changed the subject or the characters and simplified the much more complex Perugino work so as to create that kind of idea of Renaissance unity, such that nothing can be added, nothing subtracted from the form. In this case, he's taken out of the picture anything that is not essential to the picture itself. Back to this again, notice all the things that you should be able to pick out. It's a very idealistic form. They're all the same size, meaning they're all created out of canons of proportions. There's perfect symmetry between the form. If you split it down the middle, you got equal weight on both sides of this. You've got the use of linear one-point perspective that you should be able to see in the use of this, the bricks on the piazza here going back to the church. It's got a clear differentiation of foreground, middle ground, and deep background. It uses primarily blues and reds, so primary colors with a little bit of gold here, kind of yellow, another primary color here, rather than lots and lots of different colors, and has a very kind of clear focal point. Everything looks at the union of these characters, which is all about the sanctity of marriage. It also pushes the idea of rationality. Remember, these other suitors are really upset about the fact that they didn't get chosen. This guy's breaking his rod over his knee, but it doesn't look, incredibly emotional, because we want to create the ideal situation rather than a real emotional response of people. Important work for our purposes today is a series of fresco paintings that Raphael created, and you can see more examples of this in your text, for an area in the Vatican known as the Stanza della Signatura. It's usually referred to as the papal libraries, but it's also a place where the Pope signed, signatura, very important documents. And in this space, right at the same time that this Pope, Julius II, commissioned the paintings by Michelangelo for the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he had Raphael create this series of frescoes. We're only going to look at the one that's on the left, but also included in the scene were 4 different branches of knowledge: poetry, law, religion, and philosophy. We're going to look at the one that's on philosophy, the one on the left, known as the School of Athens. But you see over there on the right-hand side, and I'll show you another close-up of this at the end, the so-called disputa, the form of knowledge that comes from religion. The figures in this work aren't quite life-size, but they're almost life-size. I always make a joke. This is a work of art that is so perfect when it comes to representing the ideals of the Italian Renaissance, that it's almost as if an art historian needing a question on an exam that starts with the prompt, how is this work the most perfect example of the Italian Renaissance, went back in time and said, hey, Raphael, could you create this perfect representation for me? So let's start with the subject matter. What we're looking at is a combination of figures in this work that are taken out of primarily Greek times, who all represent the greatest minds of their time. So we have people in this work that are very identifiable, such as in the center, Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. We have Heraclitus up here in the foreground. I'll keep going over these characters, by the way. We have Euclid over here. We have kind of all the main characters from Greek philosophy and Greek sciences and Greek forms of knowledges gathered together in one space, kind of debating the nature of the universe and so forth. Also included in this scene is an architecture that doesn't fit with the idea of this being in ancient Greece, because it uses the Roman arch, and the Greeks didn't use that. But this architectural space, as your text points out, is probably based upon the new plans by Bramante, who is a friend of Raphael's, for the new St. Peter's in Rome that hadn't quite been constructed yet, but they had already come up with a plan. So they're imagining the new St. Peter's in Rome as the site of this gathering of ancient philosophers and thinkers. The other thing I want to point out is that painted in grisaille on each side, flanking each other on each side, are these sculptures up in these niches. And on the left-hand side is accompanied by a lyre, which is a kind of almost like a old harp form, and standing in contrapposto pose. This is Apollo. Apollo is the sun god in Greek times, but he is also the god of beauty and of the arts, of poetry in particular. So the god of arts and beauty over here, and then on the other side you see Minerva, or as she's known in ancient Greek times, Athena, who's the goddess of wisdom and warfare that fits into this Pope's idea of him being the warrior Pope. But what we get here then is a combination, and this is key, of art and beauty and knowledge, that these things go together, that art is a way, if created in its ideal form, of bringing us knowledge of God. So now let's go into some of the details here. We know who all these characters are. You can't see this very well, I'm sure, on your slide, but you can do a Google search and find this pretty easily. Most of the characters are identifiable, but what gets really interesting about this is that most of the characters are not just representations of ancient Greek thinkers. They're also representations of contemporary Italian Renaissance artists. And what I mean by this is that while we know this is Plato, the face of Plato is Leonardo da Vinci. While we know this figure who is Heraclitus, we also know that he is Michelangelo. Over here as Euclid, this is Bramante, Raphael's friend. And Raphael, by the way, is over here in the corner listening to Ptolemy talk about astronomy. And we'll see close-ups of this in a moment. In other words, what I'm getting at is that think of how this works. If you represent, Leonardo da Vinci as Plato, what you're saying is something like Leonardo da Vinci and Italian Renaissance artists are the inheritors of the ancient classical, philosophical, and scientific traditions. They are the latest manifestations of these things. It's a perfect example of the idea of the Renaissance, the rebirth of ancient Greek ideas. And it's a perfect example of the idea that Renaissance artists are purveyors of knowledge. Art is now a liberal art. It's not just about creating something that is pretty or pleasing to look at. It's about giving us knowledge about the world. Is set up according to ideals. You probably figured this out. It's all using linear one-point perspective to generate the overall space of the School of Athens. He also uses though something that is called linear two-point perspective, and here's just a diagram of this. Linear one-point perspective is really good at representing some kind of space, but what you see here are blocks that are turned so that their leading edge is facing towards you, and when that occurs, you need 2 points on your horizon line in order to generate the illusion of two-dimensionality. And that occurs, for instance, get you in quotes here, right here, this block upon which Michelangelo is drawing. It was said that Michelangelo carved his forms by first drawing a kind of figure on them and then carving away the form from that relief form. This is all created in linear two-point perspective with these lines receding to a vanishing point way off to the side and over here to a vanishing point over here. That is, again, a way to generate the illusion of perfect idealistic space. Now, while we're still here, let me point out that in the center is Plato and Aristotle. I've just talked about, Neoplatonism as being a combination of Plato and Aristotle's thought mixed together with Christian theology. Well, here it is in representational form. Plato holds under his arm his most famous text, the Timaeus, in which he explains the idea of the Platonic realm of forms, and he's pointing up towards the realm of Platonic forms. Although at this time, of course, people would have thought, oh, he's pointing up to heaven. Whereas Aristotle, who holds under his hand, and by the way, you can read this, it's actually written on the books themselves, his most important theoretical text, known as the Nicomachean Ethics, is saying, no, Plato, and he's pointing down to the earth to say that order exists beneath the appearance of all things here. And of course, Neoplatonism is a combination of those two ideas together. They're very clearly the focal point, aren't they? They're the vanishing point of the linear one-point perspective. They're right in the center. No one overlaps with their form. They're framed by consecutive archways to kind of lead us into them. They are the most important figures. And then we see another important figure right in the foreground, Michelangelo. Now, you might have noticed this. If I go back a little bit here, you'll see that everything is very, very ordered. Everything is very, very organized, right? That rational organization of form. In that, you look at the two figures in the center, and then you're going to move out from them. Everyone's in perfect proportions. They're all about the same height. When you get to a place where there's a gap in the figures, so as to draw our attention in this case to the sculpture up above, notice how one figure reaches out and another figure reaches out back to connect this. When you get all the way to the end, in order to again create this unity, all forms being connected, you see this diagonal line that moves us through from one arm through another arm, all the way down through another arm here to the foreground. So everything's very organized except for maybe this weird character down here who seems to be lounging around on the steps. Now, I don't know whether this is true or not, but one of the old, and it started in the time of Michelangelo, later in his career, one of the old rumors was that Raphael, while he was working on this set of frescoes, it was at the same time that Michelangelo was over in the Sistine Chapel doing his work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And originally, we know from cartoon drawings of this work, cartoons just meaning the overall plan, that Michelangelo wasn't as prominently displayed here. But rumor has it that Raphael, despite Michelangelo trying to keep it secret what he was doing, sneaked into the Sistine Chapel about halfway through his own project here in creating these frescoes, and saw the Sistine Chapel ceiling and was blown away by the genius of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But then he recognized that he hadn't given Michelangelo enough of a prominent place in his own work. So he returned and put Michelangelo right in the foreground here in order to emphasize his genius. He didn't want to be seen as a kind of, not giving Michelangelo his due. But once he had done that, he was left with a little bit of an artistic problem, which is how do you fill in this space without putting another character up here that would have to be understood as equally as important as Michelangelo? And his solution seems to have been to put this figure, who is Diogenes. Diogenes, by the way, and by the way, there are lots of different disputes over who this is, but most people believe it's Diogenes, was the cynic from ancient Greek philosophy. He's the guy who said, I never met an honest man, right? He's the guy who always is very critical and always questioning things. So he is a little bit, just by his character, the odd man out, lounging around on the stairs, a little bit recessed from Michelangelo, so as to still give Michelangelo the importance of the position, but balance him out at least a little bit with another figure here. He's also, though it should be said, ideally formed in that if you follow this orthogonal of the central point perspective, it goes directly through, on axis, Diogenes' body. More things to say about this work of art. In here up close, this is Bramante. That's a very close friend and architect of Raphael's, who was working on the plans for St. Peter's. He is being shown as Euclid, geometry here, teaching other people around him. And then you see Raphael out here on the side, looking at us from, the exterior of the scene. Raphael was notorious for being deferential to others and not wanting to appear too egotistical. And so that's probably why he put himself way out on the outside of this work. To the overall scene, one of the things that I'm going to ask you to do this week is to write about this work. And I want you to, I'm not going to say much more about this work. There's plenty of work that you can do on your own in analyzing it. I'm going to have you answer that basic question, which is, how is this a perfect example of the high Renaissance style in Italy? And you should start with the context, the rise of the middle class and humanism. You should explain Neoplatonism to some degree and how it shows up in this work. You should be able to reference all the stylistics of the Italian Renaissance when you're talking about this work. But the final thing I wanted to say to you about this work is, It's also painted in trompe l'oeil, meaning fool the eye. This part that looks like architecture here, as if you're looking through an arch, is actually painted. And this part way out here, follow my cursor, the red, is the architecture itself. So it's as if you're looking through a window onto another world. This across the way, if that's all about humanism and classical philosophy and empirical knowledges and so forth, facing it is truth through religion. This is the disputa. I'm not going to go into this, otherwise the lecture would kind of drag on and on and on. But I will say this, it's a dispute about the nature of the Holy Communion, or the host as it's called. Is the bread on the table during Mass, or the wafer, really the body of Christ? How does that occur, and so forth? And what Raphael has done is gathered together all the great theological thinkers. These are ancient popes. St. Augustine is here, and great kind of writers on the subject to dispute the nature of the Holy Sacrament. They're all fairly chaotic, right? They don't look as perfect as this realm of heaven up above, where the saints and the chosen are all sitting in perfect kind of organization, with Christ in the center and Mary on one side and John the Baptist on the other, and God up above this whole thing. That's standard Neoplatonism, right? In heaven, everything is perfect and ordered, timeless, universal, and our world is an imperfect reflection of God's order, but somewhere beneath that order is God's perfection. Notice here, again, linear one-point perspective generating the illusion of space, indicative of that idea of God's perfection being in our everyday world. Raphael, I wanted to end with this work. Very simply put, I just wanted to say that at the end of Raphael's career, he died rather young. The Medici family, which you'll read about, and I'll talk about a little bit when I talk about Michelangelo in the next lecture for this week. The Medici family actually kind of buys their way into the papacy. They're so rich, they pull so many strings that they buy their way into the papacy. And we see that here in this portrait by Raphael, known as, its title is Pope Leo X, who in the center there was once a member of the Medici family, with Cardinals Giulio de' Medici and Luigi de' Rossi. These are other members of the Medici family. Big thing to point out about this, and it used to be talked about in your text, but it's not there anymore, is that this doesn't look like a standard representation of a pope. Popes usually have their big tiara on, and they're talking to an audience, or they're looking very, very religious. What this looks like, if you were to look at a lot of portraits of aristocrats or monarchs, is a monarchical portrait, meaning it's about legacy. It's about this man becoming pope, and he's going to pass the papacy on to this man who will be pope for a little bit. He's going to die very quickly. And this cardinal is also put in place by the Medici family himself. It's a dynastic portrait, so to speak. Other things, though, that I wanted to say about this, that, again, on the surface might appear religious, but in comparison to other religious works of art, aren't really, is that in front of him he has an illuminated manuscript, which we've seen in this class before, those beautiful texts. But this is a really famous illuminated manuscript, and he's not really treating it as an object of religion. It's a collector's item, as is this beautiful medieval bell that he's got in the foreground. These are showing his culture, that he collects beautiful objects that also have religious significance to them as well. All right, next up, Michelangelo, but I'm going to stop this lecture here and set up Michelangelo as a separate lecture, just so that you can take a breather and kind of view these on your own separate time. So we have, in other words, 2 lectures for this week that have been separated.